Okay, the first thing we're going to have to do is create our HDRI image that's going to actually give reflections and give off color and hue and color bleeding in our actual scene. So in order to do that, we're going to need a program called HDR Shop. If you go to hdrshop.com, you'll go to this, it'll bring you to this address. You can see here there is a version 2 and a version 1. Version 2 is about $400, but it's more advanced and it has a lot more options for batch processing and so forth. They've been nice enough to give us the original version, version 1, which is suffice for what we're doing. Go ahead and sign away your information here, and you can download a free version of this. Again, this is at hdrshop.com, and it's a great plugin for doing panoramic transformations and all types of HDR compositing and builds. All right, we're going to jump into Adobe Photoshop CS5 Extended version. If you do not have Adobe CS3, 4, or 5 extended version, you will not have what we'll need here, which is the File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. We're going to go ahead and take those images we shot on set, and we're going to go ahead and create our HDR image. It's a little bit of a long process, but it's well worth it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and it's going to ask for an image sequence. And this process is actually going to be merging each of the 3 different angles. So in the end, we'll get 3 total files to work with. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and hit Browse, and I'll jump over to my HDR plates. And as you can see, I got image sequences from darkest to brightest. That's what we shot. Here's another set right here. And the break is when it goes from light to dark. And finally, the last one right here. So I'm going to go ahead and put these in like this and hit Open. And I'm going to click on Attempt to automatically align source images because my camera tripod was a little bit flimsy and the wind wasn't helping either, so that kind of pushed things around. This will align the image, which is really nice. All right, and this is what we get. And as you can already see, there's a little bit of a ghosting having to do with the fact we had a very windy day. And even between a couple exposures that occurred in just seconds, these clouds were really flying. So we're getting a ghosting effect. If I'd kind of back off a little bit here, get a little bit of problems here and there due to just basically alignment. Now, there's a nice little tool inside of Merge to HDR Pro, which is this Remove Ghost. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that really quick. And what that does is it basically just removes the ghost, does a great job of doing so. Now, there's an issue here that we have to be aware of, and it's a common practice whenever you do this, is to start from your beginning point here at this side and scroll back and forth and make sure your exposures go from either bright to dark or dark to bright. In this case, we got bright. The computer automatically tried to figure out what was the darkest, what was the brightest. But as we go through this, you'll see that there's one image that's giving us a problem. And unfortunately, there's really no way to adjust these inside of Merge to HDR Pro where we can actually kind of move them around. If I take this from here and move along, we see a little discrepancy here. We go from here to here to here, dark, dark, darker, and then all of a sudden we're bright again. So we're having a problem in this registering this actual image. So what we're going to do is, this image should actually be somewhere around right here. So in that case, I'm going to go ahead and just click it off so that we don't have it affect our actual file. Now the other artifact we're getting from this ghosting is, if you can see right here, our areas of grass are getting this weird red artifact on here. And another thing that I did, and you'll notice that it was purpose here, that certain shots are out of focus. Now when you turn on ghosting mode, I can go ahead and move around here, and it's going to give a priority to whatever image I choose. So I'm going to find an image that is relatively bright. It doesn't matter because with the 32-bit system, you really can't judge exposure on here because you're just seeing the different luminance values. I can move this back and forth. That is not going to affect how this gets exported at all. This is just allowing me to see the range. So I can see the brightest, I can come and see the darkest, and this is the value of an HDR image, is I can actually see that my white is being maintained in the darkest. If I did an overall brightening down of our scene on a low dynamic range image like a JPEG, this would start to become milky white and become eventually 50% gray. So the whole purpose of this is to maintain the brightness values for the computer to be fed into Maya the information that's needed for lighting and to have accurate lighting for what we had on set. And having a 32-bit image is what's very important. By default, this is usually set to 16. Just make sure you're on 32-bit and choose a priority that not only does the best in the ghosting, but also gets rid of that stupid artifact by the grass and has the best focus. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in really quick here, and I'll just give priority to a different image and see if I can find one that's decent. And again, you're seeing we're getting a little bit of artifacting from the trying to solve the ghosting. So again, this one's a little blurry. We got that artifact here. I'm pretty happy with this image right here, which is the EV00. And the focus is not the greatest because I had autofocus on. Usually you want to choose manual focus and also use the 2x zoom in on your DSLR to make sure that ball is in perfect focus. So with this all finished, I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. So as you can see here, we have a nice image. We have a nice sharpness values in here. A lot of our ghostings have been solved, and we are currently in a 32-bit mode, as we can see right here. You'll notice if you go under Image Adjust, there are certain areas that are grayed out now. We can't change curves, brightness, vibrance, but we can change levels and exposure. If I hit exposure really quick, again, we can kind of see how certain brightnesses are maintained. And because at this point I don't have any information for this area of darkness, we start to get milky whites, especially where the sun is. So the real range we have to play with when we get inside of Maya is probably about right here to about here. So we got this much range. Because after this, we don't have extra iterations. You kind of see where it starts to just do like a manual brightening, which is nasty. So with that all done, we're going to go ahead and crop this so that it's a perfect 1x1 image. And to do that, we got to make sure that rulers is on. And here they are right here. I'll left click and drag this to the edge of one of the sides of the ball. Doesn't matter which one. And I'll go ahead and click one here as well. And if you want to, you can do this. You don't have to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and show you. I'll put one to the edge here for best estimation, and then one at the bottom. This one's a little harder to figure out because this thing is kind of confusing it. So what I usually do is just say, forget that. And I'll grab my crop tool, come over here to the top, put this at the very center of the two lines, hold down shift so I get a uniform scale, and drag out and just come to this second or third line, I should say. And with that, I'm going to let go and go ahead and hit enter. And now if you check out my image size, I have a uniform 1x1 image here to 2836 by 2836. Now I'm going to save this out as a Radiance file, HDR, and we're going to put that under HDR sandwiches, and I'll go ahead and call it sandwich_1 for the first angle. Repeating the process, we're going to go again, and I'll just jump over to Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. I'm going to go ahead and jump up to my plates again and go to the second sequence, which breaks right here and ends at the brightest image. All right, and just go ahead and move my rulers in and crop this, holding down shift, and save it out. Make sure it's a radiance, and we'll call this sandwich number 2. And last but not least, we're going to go ahead and do the last image. All right, now we're going to go ahead and open up our 3 images just to kind of look at them. What's important to realize is sometimes the 7D or most DSLRs will change the image size of what you actually put out. So you got to have to do more of a manual when you decide what the image size is for a 7D or any other digital camera. So let's go ahead and take a look at our image resolutions here. We've got a 2836 on this one. We've got a 2677, and we got a 2851. So this one, it seems to be the largest. Control C that, and we're going to resize these other two. We're going to choose the largest one so we maintain the highest resolution across the board. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to 2851. Same thing here. All right, so I'm going to go save these out. And now we're going to move into HDR Shop. All right, I'm going to open up our images now. And when these images come in, they're going to be extremely zoomed in, so we have to kind of zoom them out manually. It's kind of weird. So I'm going to go ahead and say right click, say zoom out, zoom out, zoom out. And just to have these off to the side, just to see what I'm looking at. So we've got 3, we've got 2, and we have 1. So what I'm going to do here first is take this and we're going to unwrap these to panoramic. So I'm going to go image, panoramic, panoramic transformation. We're going to go from mirrored ball to latitude, longitude. I want to maintain this resolution here, and this is something that the program of HDRShop likes to like down res for you, and you don't want to do that. You want to maintain as much as possible. So I hit Control C and Control V so that I maintain the highest width. I'm going to lose a little bit on the height here, but the width I want to keep the same. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. There we go. And now it's called warped, as you can see, and this is what we get. We're going to be usually using a lot of the information in here, and this stuff right here is going to be replaced with some other image. So these are sort of like the error areas. We are only getting right now a 180-degree view of our actual set, and that's why we chose to shoot the other 2 angles to get the other 2 angles. I'm going to move this over here, and I'll go ahead and close the number 1. I don't need that anymore. And we'll do this the same for these. And now we're going to save all of these out. So here is number 3. Here is number 2. If you want to move around these, you can use your middle mouse button and kind of move them around. But you can see these are just different angles. So I'm going to save these out, and we're going to maintain a radiance format. Again, we got to keep that all the way through. And I'm going to choose HDR unwrapped, and we'll go ahead and call this unwrap 1. Now it's back into Photoshop to finish this up. Alright, so here we are back in Photoshop. We have our 3 unwrapped images here, with our first one being a little bit blurry. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over here to Filter and show you a little tool you can use to get rid of that blur. It doesn't really destroy it completely, or get rid of it completely. But if I hit Smart Sharpen on here, the default settings of 119 and a radius of 7.7 will give you a decent change. I'll go ahead and move this over to the side and just look at the image. You can see before and after. So we're getting a little bit of a better sharpening, and I'm going to go ahead and stick with that. So here's the other 2 images, and again, we're getting a little bit of artifacting up here, but the very thing to remember here is we are very far away from objects way out in the distance here. And that's something to be understanding here, that really we're not getting close reflections of a building or so forth. A more accurate, well-shot HDR image would be very imperative if you had something very close up, such as an interior, or if you were along a city street, you really had to have those reflections perfect of the buildings along the edges and so forth. But we're in an open country here. We really don't have much here except this being an overall reflection of ground and a background of green trees and a blue sky. So really you're almost looking like an HDR image we could have created ourselves. But again, it's the little details that make everything look real. Your eye will pick up on the little subtleties, and it'll decide whether or not what you're looking at is really realistic or if it's fake. So we want to be as accurate to what we had on set as possible. So as you can see, these areas along the side here are completely useless, but the areas in this quadrant are actually usable. So the first thing I do is I choose any image, and I'll start with 2 here, and I'll go ahead and go under Image, Canvas Size. And this is not going to actually change the resolution of the image, but just the canvas itself. So we are going to increase pixels, or we want to increase the width pixels. So instead of 2851, we're going to choose something like, I'd say for now, probably 5,000. And this little arrow says which way do we want to push it. Do we want to push it out to the left? Do we want to keep it centered? And in this case, we want to keep it centered. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And what we have is just extra room along the sides here to work. And to me, this is probably not enough. So I'm going to go ahead and my canvas size again, choose pixels, and we'll just shoot this up to something like 6,500. Hit OK. So now we have plenty of room here to add extra scenes. So I know very well, and I usually like to do this ahead of time here, is just kind of understand that this area right here is not going to be usable. So there are ways of kind of bookmarking it. You can go ahead and come in here and paint over it or something, but I'm just going to leave it as is to show you what we have to do here. The next step is to take from either image 1 or image 3, and I'm going to look for a pattern. So I'm just going to grab 3 here, and I'm not going to grab anything over here where it's too warped. I'm just going to go about as far as here. So I'll go ahead and hit Control C and hit Control V. Now, because we maintain proper resolution height as far as the image size, this should be a good equivalent. It might be bigger if you didn't change and do a uniform image scale like we did earlier. So right now, if I hold down Shift and drag across, I have like a little bit of a snapping that we can do here. So what I usually like to do is look for the pattern in the back here. So I can usually turn off and on, and I want to look for a pattern in the back, and it's going to be a little difficult because the only real ID we have are these little tree lines. So it's a little bit tricky. So we can kind of look in our image here, and we don't see that too well in here. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this image and turn it off. Let's jump over to image 1, and let's go ahead and grab that. Again, I'm just going to grab the area that I think I can use and go ahead and paste it in. There we go. Again, this looks a little blotchy here and there, but we can still use this information to create our set. So I'm going to kind of play around here. One of the other great indentations of where everything at is, of course, the sun itself. So we know that the sun is right here. So here I can kind of come over here and line up the sun. I can start to bring these together. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at that third layer. I'll go ahead and put this at the bottom. So we can see a pattern here and here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring my opacity down a little bit. And try to match these as best as possible. So we're close enough. But again, we have this issue here where it's kind of arced up. And we also have an exposure difference, which we're going to adjust for in a little bit. So with this image selected, I can use a tool, Edit, Transform, Warp. This is a nice tool which allows me to come in here and kind of bend this together. I'm going to start bending this image in a little bit, like so. So it's sort of parallel across and parallel to the line above here. And then I'll go ahead and hit Enter. And now I'm going to go ahead and attack that first image and say Edit. In fact, I should do a selection here just to... And I like this information, but I want to maintain this information here as much as possible. So I'm pretty accurate, but now I got the bow up again here. So I'm going to go back to my background image. I'm going to select everything here. And again, I'm going to go Edit, Transform, Warp. And I'm just going to poke around here until this starts to go perfectly parallel. This is such a nice tool. Okay, and hit Enter. I'll jump over to image 2 and do the same thing. All right. So we can see we've got a little bit of an issue as far as exposure on this middle image right here, which would be the original background. So I'm going to go ahead before I even start and jump into exposure and see if we can kind of tone this down and match it up. Now there are color matching tools you can use for this, but I'm just going to stick with what I got here and just eyeball it the best I can. Okay. And now, of course, if I wanted to, I could adjust hue saturation because it's still pretty saturated in the brown. And I think that's probably the closest we're ever going to really need to get. We're going to be blending these three together, but I'm not too concerned about just having it absolutely perfect. So let's kind of start from the layers down. So I usually leave the first layer on, and here's the second layer right here. So at this point, I want to get rid of these warped areas. So I want to see where my overlap is, and I have a lot of overlap. And I want to get rid of the dirtiest areas the most. So what you can do for that is for the second layer, create a layer right here. And this will create a layer mask. And what you're going to do for that is use your brush, and with your X key, you're going to go back and forth between white and black and kind of create a non-destructive erase. So I'll go ahead and hit X and kind of come in here. All right. So I'm happy with that. Again, there's a little bit of differentiation in color, a bit blotchy. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to my next image. And we're going to go ahead and put a layer mask on for that one. And make sure we're in the brush mode and go between X to erase. And I can start to see where this kind of starts folding in. So one of the things that's common for HDRI is actually taking out the person that's shooting with your camera. Since we have such close proximity, or such far proximity, I should say, because of the three angles, you usually want to do maybe a 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. You get more overlap, and the more overlap allows you to come in here and actually take out this person. So one of the things you can either use is your clone brush or whatever tool that you might want to use. I'm going to first merge all these down by hitting Control E and hit Preserve.
and so forth. And I'm going to go ahead and just, since this is a pretty simple image to comp out, I'll just go ahead and grab an image right here. And for my feather, I'm going to set it up to something like 5, or maybe something like 10 would probably be better. And I'll go ahead and just kind of go like this, hit Control C, Control V, and move it over here and kind of comp myself out. Again, I could create a layer mask. I'm just going to do a quick use of my erase tool. And now I can come in here and merge this in, Control E, and then come down here. And I'm not a fan of using the clone brush. You can start to get blotchy, but if you want to, you can just kind of, in this situation, because of what we're doing, I'll kind of come in here and get rid of this tripod shadow as much as possible. And the first thing I'm going to do is come along and see where I can use an indentation of maybe the tree line to create the crop. Let's say about right there. So that's where the looping pattern begins. Here's the tree line, here's the same tree line. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter to crop it. And I also have this area up here that I need to crop. So I have to crop this again. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in the crop, and I'm going to crop this from the top here where the white is because of all my warping. And I'll crop this up a little bit like that. There we go. Now a lot of this is just cleanup time. But before I do that, I want to use a filter called Other Offset. And I want to use the horizon here and bring it along till I see in the center that kind of nasty line. And we need to fix that. So a couple ways of doing that is to find an image in here where the sun looks pretty good. And it looks pretty good here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this right here and copy it, bring it back, and kind of paste it over where that little indentation is. So it's not going to be perfect. That's one thing you guys got to remember. But it's going to give you just an overall exposure. Now there's some lines down here, and I'm just going to leave those as is. But right now we've got our actors out of the actual scene. And again, the more angles you shoot this, the better off you are at kind of stitching this together because you'll have more to work from. So if 3 angles is not enough, go for 4, go for 8, and just have sort of a measuring system out there to do so.
All right, so we're in Maya 2011 now, and we're going to go ahead and create a polygon sphere. And we'll duplicate it over. So we have just 2 spheres. The one I'm going to leave with the default Maya Lambert or Grayscale Lambert. And the other one, we're going to go into Hypershade. And we're going to build a Maya Material X Passes node, which is a architectural material specifically in Mental Ray. So in order to get to that, we can just kind of click down to Mental Ray here and come down to Materials. And as you can see here, we have a whole array of materials. The all-in-one material that can do all types of materials is the Maya Material X Passes. It's sort of a chameleon style shader. And if I double click on this, there's a little preset up here, and you might not be able to see it from the side, but I have Chrome to choose from, and I'll hit replace. And I'll go ahead and assign that to one of these spheres. Now under my render globals, we want to make sure I'm rendering inside of Mental Ray. And for quality, we're going to very quickly set this to production. So the first thing we want to do is to show one of the 2 ways that image-based lighting, or IBL, can be introduced. The first one is through the typical render globals. So if we go to the render globals under indirect lighting, we have IBL, image-based lighting, and I'll go ahead and hit create. What that does is it creates a sphere in the actual scene. And if I go to my outliner, we can see we have this indirect light, not a direct light like a directional light or a spotlight, but an indirect light called Mental Ray IBL1. And if we go into our Hypershade, you will see this under the lights section. So if I go to lights, as you can see, it's right here. So if I were to bring in like a directional light, there'd be directional lights in here. So it constitutes a light inside of Maya. So what we do is we're going to go ahead and kind of back off of here and show you what you have here. You can grab this by kind of lasso grabbing and rotating. You can also scale, and you can also translate. Now for the IBL node, we're going to plug in our image, and under textures is where we dropped our final HDRI. Now at first it looks a little dark or semi-transparent. If we come down here to our alpha gain, we can bring this up. This has nothing to do with color as far as affecting our images here. It's just for us to see inside of Maya, that's all. This here is broke it's just to give you an idea as far as the different exposures. It doesn't actually change the exposure. This is all hardware-based stuff for you to kind of take a look at. Where the real color adjustment comes is in this color gain right here. So let's go ahead and do a basic render. So I'll just kind of frame it up here and hit render. So right now we are getting lighting information that specifically only reflections into our sphere right here, but we're not actually getting the hues and the color bleeding and the lighting from the IBL affecting the actual scene. And that has to do with the fact that we don't have Final Gather turned on. So I'll go ahead and save this, and we're going to go ahead and turn on image-based lighting's Final Gather. So if we go to Final Gather, this will start the color bleeding process. And let's go ahead and do a render now. Okay. So let's kind of take a look at the two different changes here. Now we have actual lighting actually affecting our sphere. And if it's not too hard to see, but if you kind of take a look at it, this sphere on top is getting sort of a blue hue, and down here we're getting this sort of brown hue from the actual ground. And the same thing is going on at this sphere also, but right now this thing is set to chrome, so you're not going to see too much of that. So as you can see, there is lighting information taking place. If we want to amp up the power of the color bleeding from the image or the lighting from the actual IBL node onto these spheres, we can take the color gain here and we can take the value. So let's go ahead and jump over to a HSV, and here's the value. And for the value, we can probably bring this up to something like 5. So I'll go ahead and save it, and let's go ahead and do another render. So we can see in the background our image-based lighting is really starting to amp it up. And in doing so, what we have here is a more intense bleeding of the color on our actual IBL node and right here at the bottom. We've also brightened up our reflection too in the chrome ball, as you can see. Now, what if we want to control these separately? Well, we can go ahead and set this back to something like 1. And just to get a clean plate, we'll go ahead and hit render. So this is what we had when we first started out. We have Final Gather lighting coming in. We can separate this in regards to environment lighting and the actual effect of the Final Gather. And that's under render stats. If we come to render stats, there's these two options that kind of subdivide this gain. This is an overall gain that does two things. As you increase the value, it increases the amount of reflection, the brightness, and it increases the effect of Final Gather color bleeding and really starts to bluify the top and, brownify the bottom. So in order to do these independently, we can come down here and adjust them one at a time. So we have adjust environment color effect and adjust Final Gather color effect. So now we can work these independently. So with this image saved, I'm going to go ahead and amp up the color gain value to 5 again. And let's go ahead and see what we get. Okay, so we've managed to up the brightness of the reflection, but we have not affected the Final Gather power. So that hasn't changed. So let's do the opposite now. Let's take this color gain and set this back to 1. And then under the color gain of the Final Gather effect, let's bring that up to 5. So now we have the opposite happening. We have the reflection brightness not changing, but the effect of the Final Gather, the influence, the pushing of the Final Gather is actually intense. So here's the difference. Here's both of them together with the primary gain and individually. So you can see how that works. Now the other option you have here is under the option for primary visibility. And if we turn that off, I'll go ahead and do a render. In fact, I'll just bring these values back again, just so we're back and even. Bring this back to 1. I'll go ahead and render it again. With this option on now, we have an alpha and we don't have that Final Gather or the IBL node in the background in our scene, which is very helpful when we want to start compositing this stuff. As we get farther into our projects, I'll begin to go into this light emission emit light, which actually not only does a Final Gather, but actually takes the pixels inside of these IBL nodes and actually assigns sort of a directional light to them. So there'll be a bazillion of directional lights in there, and whatever color the actual pixel is what will come down and will actually create shadows and so forth. This is a little bit more expensive, but we'll go in how to optimize this as we start to build up our scenes. The other way to do image-based lighting is through just creating a surface shader material. So let's go ahead and knock out this Mental Ray IBL node. So all we have currently is just Final Gather turned on. So we're going to go ahead and create a polygon sphere, and we'll scale it out. And with that sphere, we're going to jump into our Hypershade. And by jumping over to our surfaces, we can find the Surface Shader. Surface Shader is what you see is what you get. It doesn't do any shading. It just basically gives you what you get. So neon materials are usually used for this. I'm going to go ahead and plug in a file node for the color itself. And then the file node itself, we're going to be plugging in the final HDRI image. I'll give it a few seconds to kind of load in here. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and take the sphere. I'll go ahead and assign it to Surface Shader. And I don't see anything. I might have to turn on hardware texturing and give it a few seconds. There it is. Now currently it's very, very blurry. If you want to, you can go to hardware texturing, and if you have a decent video card, you can change it to whatever you wish and get it to the highest resolution just so you can kind of see where everything is at. So there we go. Give my computer a second. So again, I'm going to orientate this where my sun is towards the shot of the camera when the camera gets brought into the scene. And with that said, let's go ahead and do a render and see what we get. Alrighty. So as you can see, we are getting lighting information from the top and from the bottom. If we want to increase the power of this in the same way that we did it inside of the IBL node, you're going to go under the actual file texture itself, which is right here. And under color balance, you have something called color gain. So under color gain, I'm going to come in here and we'll take the value and we'll amp that up to 5 like we did before. And as you can see, my hardware texturing is kind of taking over here. And this is taking some time to kind of calculate. So I might want to turn off my hardware texturing. As you can see, it's just taking some time. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one more render. And we're back to where we were before. As you can see, there's a little bit more of a brightness element to it, as you can see right here. So there is a little bit of a shift in difference, and it has to mostly do with the distance of the actual material to the actual scene, how far that sphere is to these actual spheres. So distance does matter as far as color bleeding and affecting. Now, the disadvantage of using this way of working is the fact that we cannot control independently the reflection and the final gather effect like we would on the IBL node. We don't have that option here, as you can see. One option we do have is to turn off the primary visibility of the piece of geometry. So I can come in here and grab this thing and come over to here and come under render stats, under the shape node, and just turn off primary visibility. So once again, I'll go ahead and render this. And there we go. We have our alpha. So it's up to you, but in our projects, we will be using the IBL node inside of our indirect lighting, which is right here, because we have so many other options, as well as emit light, which we will be using in this project. So that's pretty much it for understanding and creating our HDRI image.